Forgotten Souls. The town of Hollow Creek was quiet. Too quiet. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, it was a place where nothing much happened. The residents went about their lives, following routines like clockwork. But those who ventured near the old, abandoned church at the edge of town often spoke of a strange, unsettling feeling, as though they were being watched by unseen eyes. Some claimed to hear whispers, but the stories were always dismissed as superstitions, the type that grew in small towns like weeds. Emma had heard the stories growing up, though she never put much stock in them. She had moved away to the city for college, but returned after her parents' passing, inheriting their creaky old house on the outskirts of Hollow Creek. It was a bittersweet homecoming, her grief still raw, but a sense of duty compelled her to stay and settle her family's affairs. One crisp autumn evening, Emma was organizing her parents' attic when she found an old photograph buried under layers of dust. It was a picture of the church taken decades ago. In the photo, a group of people stood in front of the church, smiling. But as Emma examined it closer, her heart skipped a beat. Among the familiar faces of the townspeople, she saw a figure that shouldn't be there. A young girl with pale skin and wide, haunting eyes, standing in the back, partially obscured by shadow. Emma had never seen this girl before, yet something about her felt wrong. Curiosity gnawed at her. She asked the town historian, Mr. Wallace, about the church and the people in the photograph. The old man's face paled when she showed him the picture. He rubbed his temples and stared at it for a long while before speaking. The church was shut down over 50 years ago, after a series of tragic events, he began, his voice shaking. Several children went missing, and no one could explain it. The town searched for weeks, but never found a trace. The church was the center of the investigation since the pastor, Father Callahan, had been acting strange in his final days, but he disappeared along with the last child. Emma shivered. What about the girl in the photo? Mr. Wallace's eyes darkened. That's Lily Pearson. She was one of the missing children. They say her soul never left. Despite his warning, Emma couldn't let it go. The story of the missing children haunted her dreams, and the image of Lily Pearson kept flashing in her mind. She had to know more. That night, with nothing but a flashlight and her courage, she made her way to the abandoned church. The path was overgrown with weeds, and the structure itself was in ruin. Boards cracked, windows shattered, and the door hung off its hinges. Yet, as she approached, the air grew heavy, thick with something she couldn't explain. It was like the atmosphere itself was alive, pulsating with an energy that set her teeth on edge. Inside, the church was a hollow shell of its former self. The pews were broken, dust coated everything, and the once grand altar was draped in cobwebs. Emma swept the beam of her flashlight across the room, her heart pounding in her chest. And then she heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, like a distant breeze brushing against her ear, but it grew louder. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate. Help us. Emma froze. The whisper came again, louder this time. Another voice joined in, and another. Soon the air was filled with the murmurs of dozens of voices, all overlapping, all begging for help. She turned on her heel, ready to flee, when she caught sight of something, movement at the back of the church. A figure, small and slight, stepped out of the shadows. It was the girl from the photograph, Lily Pearson. Her eyes were wide, filled with sorrow, and her lips trembled as she spoke. You have to help us. Emma backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. Help you? How? What do you want? Lily's gaze never wavered. We're trapped, forgotten. We can't leave. Not until he does. Emma's mind raced. Who? Lily pointed to the altar. Father Callahan. Emma turned her flashlight toward the altar. There, standing just beyond the reach of the light, was a shadowy figure, tall and gaunt, cloaked in black. The figure slowly moved forward, and Emma could feel the temperature drop. Her breath fogged the air in front of her, and her body trembled with an unnatural cold. Father Callahan. He was as much a specter as the children, but something about him felt wrong. He didn't plead or beg like the others. Instead, his presence was malevolent, hungry. Emma understood in a flash. He wasn't trapped with the children. He was holding them there, feeding off their fear, their souls. Panicked, Emma looked around the church, searching for something, anything to stop him. Her eyes landed on an old rusted cross hanging above the altar. In a surge of adrenaline, she grabbed the cross and held it out in front of her like a shield. "Let them go!" she shouted, her voice shaking. The priest hissed, his form flickering like a dying flame. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, until the walls of the church seemed to hum with their intensity. The cross glowed faintly in her hands, and with a final guttural scream, the figure of Father Callahan dissolved into nothingness. The whispers stopped. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by an eerie stillness. When Emma turned, Lily was gone. The church felt empty. Not just physically, but spiritually, as if whatever dark presence had haunted it for decades was finally gone. Emma stumbled out of the church, her heart racing, and looked back one last time. The old structure seemed more decrepit now, like a shell of a memory. The souls had been freed. But as Emma made her way back to town, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. In the distance, she heard a faint whisper, carried on the wind. "We never leave." The voice was Lily's. The town of Hollow Creek had its secrets, and some souls were never meant to be freed.
Story number 2.
Ghostly warning. It was a chilly autumn evening when Emily received the call. Her great-aunt Margaret had passed away, leaving her an old, dilapidated mansion in the countryside. Despite never having been close to Margaret, the allure of owning an estate intrigued Emily. Recently divorced and in need of an escape from the city, she decided to spend the weekend at the mansion, partially to clear her head and partially out of curiosity. The mansion stood alone at the edge of a dense forest, shrouded in mist that seemed to linger even in daylight. Its large, ivy-covered stone walls gave it a menacing appearance, but Emily was determined. She arrived just as the sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the sprawling grounds. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, filled with the musty scent of abandonment. Dusty furniture stood as it had for decades, untouched by time. There was something unsettling about how everything was left in place, as though Margaret had simply vanished, leaving behind an echo of her life. As Emily explored the rooms, she noticed peculiar things: a set of paintings whose eyes seemed to follow her, the occasional draft despite closed windows, and the unnerving sensation that someone was watching. Dismissing these feelings as nerves, she shrugged them off. But there was one room that caught her attention: Margaret's old bedroom at the far end of the mansion. The door creaked open, revealing a room filled with antiques, ornate lamps, a large oak wardrobe, and a mirror standing against the wall. The bed was neatly made, except for a weathered diary resting on the nightstand. Drawn to it, Emily picked up the book and flipped through its pages. The entries were cryptic, with vague references to dreams, shadows, and warnings. But what unsettled Emily the most was the final entry: "Beware the visitor at midnight. Do not trust them." A chill ran down her spine. Was it a mere rambling of an old woman losing her mind, or something more sinister? She closed the diary and decided to explore more, trying to shake off the growing unease. As night fell, the mansion took on an entirely different character. The wind howled through the trees outside, making the old house groan as if in pain. Emily, still rationalizing everything, made herself a cup of tea and sat by the fireplace in the grand hall. She was determined not to let her imagination run wild. The clock struck 11:30 p.m. The sound echoed through the empty halls, reminding her of the diary's warning: "Beware the visitor at midnight." Laughing at herself, Emily decided it was time to turn in. She walked upstairs and into Margaret's room, feeling oddly drawn to sleep there. She reasoned it was the most comfortable bed in the house. As she settled into bed, her eyelids heavy, the house seemed to fall into a deeper silence. She was drifting off when she heard it, a soft knock at the front door. Her eyes flew open. Who could be visiting at this hour? She quickly glanced at the clock. 11:59 p.m. The knock came again, louder this time. Her heart raced, and every instinct told her not to answer, but her curiosity won out. She grabbed a flashlight and tiptoed down the creaky staircase, reaching the grand entrance just as the clock began to chime midnight. The knocking stopped. Standing at the door, she hesitated, remembering the diary's cryptic warning: "Do not trust them." Emily held her breath and peeked through the keyhole, but all she saw was darkness. Just as she was about to walk away, there was a final, resounding knock that shook the door. Against her better judgment, she unlocked and opened it. Nothing. The porch was empty, and the night was eerily still. She stepped out, shining the flashlight across the yard, just mist and shadows. Her pulse slowed, and she began to laugh at her paranoia. But when she turned to go back inside, she froze. In the doorway, she saw it. A figure, pale, translucent, hovering just inches above the floor. Its face was hollow, its eyes dark pits of nothingness. Emily staggered back, her throat tight with fear. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at her. "Leave. Now." It whispered in a voice that sounded like the rustling of dead leaves. Terror gripped her, but her legs refused to move. The figure stepped closer, its presence cold and suffocating. The house seemed to warp around it, the walls groaning under the weight of its energy. "Go before it's too late." The ghostly voice warned again, more urgent now. Suddenly, a sharp breeze blew through the open door, and Emily felt a force push her backward, breaking her paralysis. She scrambled to her feet, rushed inside, and slammed the door shut. The air inside felt heavy, thick with a presence that didn't belong. Frantic, Emily backed away from the entrance, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She could still feel the ghost's cold warning lingering in her bones. The house was silent again, but something was off. She turned and saw a shadow moving at the top of the staircase. Her heart stopped. It wasn't the ghost from outside. This figure was darker, more solid, and exuded a malevolence she hadn't felt before. A grin twisted its featureless face, and it began to descend the stairs toward her. Emily's mind flashed to the diary, Margaret's final warning about the visitor at midnight. The ghost hadn't been a threat, it had been a protector, trying to warn her. This was the real danger, and it had been waiting inside all along. The figure reached the bottom of the stairs, its presence filling the room with an oppressive weight. Emily backed toward the door, fumbling with the lock. The entity moved closer, its eyes glowing with malice. Just as it was about to reach her, Emily managed to throw the door open and fled into the night. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. Behind her, the mansion stood still and silent, as if it had swallowed its secret once again. As she sped away down the foggy road, one thought haunted her. The ghost hadn't been there to harm her. It had been trying to save her from something far worse, and she had almost let it in.
Story number 3.
The ghost's secret. It was a cold, damp night when Emma stumbled upon the old manor on the outskirts of town. The locals called it Hollow House, and it had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. Growing up, she had always heard stories about it, how people disappeared there, how strange sounds echoed from its depths. But Emma wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. Now, as she stood at the rusted iron gates, she couldn't help but feel a chill run down her spine. Her curiosity, however, was stronger than her fear. She had recently moved back to her hometown after a decade of living in the city, and the memories of this place tugged at her. As a child, she had always wanted to explore the manor, but was too afraid. Tonight, it felt like the perfect opportunity. Something in the air drew her in, an almost magnetic pull. Emma pushed open the gate, the rusty hinges creaking as if the house itself was groaning awake. She crossed the overgrown garden, her boots crunching on dead leaves. As she approached the front door, it opened on its own, a slow, deliberate movement that made her hesitate for just a moment. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing in the empty space. No response. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The interior was a mess. Dust-covered furniture, broken windows, and faded wallpaper peeling off the walls. A grand staircase led to the upper floors, while a long hallway stretched into the darkness. Emma fished out her phone and turned on the flashlight. The narrow beam of light cut through the gloom, revealing portraits on the walls. Most were worn beyond recognition, but one, hanging near the staircase, caught her eye. It was a painting of a woman with dark eyes, her expression unreadable, but somehow sad. The nameplate below the portrait was so tarnished she could barely make out the name, Lydia Holloway. "I wonder what happened to you," Emma muttered, her gaze lingering on the woman. As if in response, a gust of wind swept through the house, rattling the windows. The door behind her slammed shut with a bang, causing Emma to jump. She laughed nervously. "Get it together," she whispered to herself. She made her way down the hallway, her footsteps echoing eerily. The farther she walked, the more she felt like she was being watched. There was a weight in the air, an unsettling presence that made her skin prickle. She paused, listening. Somewhere ahead, she heard the faint sound of footsteps, light, almost hesitant. "Is someone there?" she called out. No answer. She followed the sound down the hallway until she reached a door at the end. It was slightly ajar, and a soft light spilled out from the crack. Her heart pounded in her chest as she pushed it open and stepped inside. It was a small parlor, untouched by time. The furniture here was immaculate, and a fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The air smelled sweet, like roses. Sitting in the chair by the fire was a woman in a flowing white dress. Her back was to Emma, but the dress was unmistakable. It was the same as the one worn by Lydia Holloway in the portrait. "Excuse me," Emma said cautiously, but the woman didn't move. Emma took a step forward. "Are you Lydia?" The woman stood up slowly, her movements fluid yet unnatural, and turned to face Emma. Her eyes were hollow, black pits, and her face was gaunt. Her skin stretched thin over her bones. A cold, hollow voice filled the room, though the woman's lips did not move. "You shouldn't be here." Emma gasped and stumbled back, her heart racing. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. Panic surged through her as she tried to yank the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The ghostly figure of Lydia moved closer, her hollow eyes fixed on Emma. "They never leave," the voice whispered. "They always stay." Emma's mind raced. She had to get out, but how? Desperation gripped her, and she screamed, "What do you want from me?" Lydia stopped mere inches from her, and in that moment something shifted. The malevolent air around her softened, and her dark eyes flickered with a strange, distant sadness. "I want you to know my secret," the voice murmured. Emma froze, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Secret?" The ghost reached out, her cold fingers brushing Emma's hand. Instantly, the world around Emma blurred, and a vision flooded her mind. She saw the manor as it once was, grand, full of life. She saw Lydia, alive, walking the halls with a man. There was love between them, but it was fleeting. The vision changed, growing darker, showing Lydia discovering her lover's betrayal. Heartbroken, she confronted him, but things spiraled out of control. In a moment of rage, he pushed her down the grand staircase. She tumbled, her neck snapping upon impact with the marble floor. The man fled, leaving her body behind, and from that day, Lydia's spirit remained trapped in the house, waiting for someone to uncover the truth. The vision faded, and Emma was back in the parlor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at Lydia, now transparent and fragile. "He killed you," Emma whispered. Lydia nodded slowly, but no one ever believed it. They thought it was an accident. "Now you know." Emma swallowed hard. "What do you want me to do?" "Tell them the truth. Set me free." Before Emma could respond, the room plunged into darkness. The fire went out, and Lydia's form dissolved into the shadows. The door behind Emma creaked open, and the oppressive weight lifted from the air. Trembling, Emma ran out of the house, her heart still pounding. As she crossed the threshold, she heard one final whisper carried on the wind. "Thank you." The next morning, Emma made her way to the town archives. She uncovered the truth about Lydia's death, long buried in history, forgotten by most. Armed with the truth, she told the town what had really happened at Hollow House all those years ago. But as she left the archives, she couldn't shake the feeling that something still wasn't right. That night, as she lay in bed, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number. "You may have freed her, but he's still here." And then the lights went out.
Story number 4.
Sarah had always been drawn to the old house on Thornhill Road. Its weather-beaten facade, with paint peeling off in thin curls, stood out like a sore thumb in the otherwise modern neighborhood. Every time she passed by it, she felt a strange pull, as though the house itself was calling to her. It was abandoned now, had been for years, but the massive bay window on the second floor always seemed to glisten in the light, as though someone was watching from behind the grimy glass. "You're crazy to think about moving in there," her friend Michelle had warned when Sarah mentioned her plans. "People say it's haunted. The last family that lived there disappeared without a trace." But Sarah, fresh out of a rough breakup and seeking solitude, didn't care. The price was right, and something about the house felt right, familiar even. She couldn't explain it, but she felt like she needed to be there. The first few nights in the house were uneventful. except for the creaking sounds that echoed through the halls at odd hours. Sarah chalked it up to the house settling or the wind rattling the old windows. But on the fourth night, something changed. She had just climbed into bed when she heard it, a soft tap 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 on the glass. Her heart raced. The sound was coming from the window in her bedroom. She pushed aside the thin curtains, half expecting to see a branch tapping against the glass. But there was nothing outside, just the empty street bathed in the dim glow of the streetlights. Probably just the wind, she muttered to herself, pulling the covers tighter around her. The tapping persisted every night after that. Sometimes it would last for minutes, other times it was just a few taps, but it was always the same. Tap, tap, tap. And each time she looked out, there was nothing there. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was trying to get her attention. One evening, while unpacking a box of old photo albums, Sarah found a small dust-covered journal tucked between the pages of a book. It wasn't hers. The leather-bound cover was worn, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. Curious, she began to flip through it. The handwriting was delicate, almost childlike, and the entries were sporadic. It belonged to someone named Emma, who had lived in the house decades earlier. One entry in particular caught Sarah's eye. February 14th, 1924. He watches me from the window. He says I'm his, but I don't want to be. I told Mother, but she says it's all in my head. But I know he's real. He's always watching. Sarah's skin prickled as she read the words. She flipped through the rest of the journal, scanning for more mentions of the mysterious watcher. Emma wrote about him several times, describing how she would wake up at night to see a figure standing outside her window, staring at her from the darkness. No matter what her parents did, changing rooms, locking windows, he always returned. The last entry was dated a few weeks after the first. March 4th, 1924. Mother says it's time to leave, that we need to get away from him. But I know it's too late. He's in the house now. He comes to me at night, whispers my name. I don't know how to make him stop. Sarah shivered and slammed the journal shut. The house suddenly felt colder, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and bend. The tap, tap, tap on the window sounded again, louder this time. She forced herself to look, her heart pounding in her chest. A face stared back at her. It was pale, with hollow, sunken eyes that seemed to glow in the moonlight. Its lips were twisted into a grotesque smile. She screamed and stumbled backward, knocking over the box of photo albums. When she looked again, the figure was gone. Sarah spent the next day researching the house. What she found chilled her to the bone. In 1924, the entire family that lived in the house, Emma's family, had disappeared. No bodies were ever found, but there had been rumors of a man who had been obsessed with Emma, a suitor who wouldn't take no for an answer. After the family vanished, some locals reported seeing a man in the windows of the house at night, but he was never caught. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, she tried to convince herself it was all in her head. The face she'd seen had to have been a trick of the light, maybe a reflection. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Tap, tap, tap. She bolted upright, her eyes darting to the window. There he was again, his face pressed against the glass, grinning at her. This time she didn't scream. She couldn't. Her throat felt tight, her limbs heavy, as if something was holding her down. The figure at the window slowly raised a hand and pointed at her, his grin widening. The air in the room grew thick and oppressive, and Sarah could feel an icy breath on the back of her neck. She forced herself to turn around. There, standing in the shadows at the foot of her bed, was a tall figure. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, the same hollow eyes she had seen in the window. It whispered her name, just like Emma had described in her journal. Suddenly, it all made sense. The house, the strange pull she'd felt toward it, the tapping at the window. She wasn't the first. The entity, whatever it was, had been watching her from the moment she'd arrived. And now, just like Emma, she was his. With a surge of adrenaline, Sarah grabbed the journal from her bedside table and hurled it at the window. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, and the figure outside vanished into the night. But the figure in the room didn't move. It stepped closer, its cold breath brushing against her face. In the last moments before the darkness claimed her, Sarah realized the truth. The ghost had never been in the window. It had always been inside.
Story number 5.
Ghostly Guide. David had always been drawn to old, forgotten places. It was a fashion he couldn't explain, a mix of curiosity and a strange sense of nostalgia. So when he stumbled upon the abandoned town of Briar Hollow during an aimless drive through the countryside, it felt like fate. Briar Hollow had been deserted for decades, its crumbling buildings swallowed by overgrown weeds and creeping vines. The town was ghostly silent, except for the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant call of a bird. But even those sounds seemed muffled, as if something was stifling them. David parked his car at the town's edge and began exploring, camera in hand. The day was overcast, with thick clouds hanging low in the sky, giving everything an eerie, muted tone. As he wandered through the streets, he noticed something odd. The further he went into the town, the more he felt like he was being watched. At first, he brushed it off as his imagination, but then he saw her. Standing at the entrance of what looked like an old general store was a woman, her figure still against the decaying wood. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, a pale blue dress that seemed out of place. David paused, startled by her presence. "You lost?" she asked, her voice soft but carrying through the empty streets. David blinked, unsure of how to respond. Just exploring," he said, taking a step closer. "I didn't think anyone still lived here." "I don't," she replied simply, her gaze fixed on him. "But I can show you around if you'd like." Something about her felt off. Her face was strangely pale, and her eyes had an otherworldly gleam. But David's curiosity got the better of him. He nodded, feeling an inexplicable pull toward her. The woman introduced herself as Evelyn and began to guide David through the town. She spoke in a quiet, measured tone, telling him stories about Briar Hollow's past. As they walked, David noticed the peculiar way she moved, silent, as if her feet barely touched the ground. Every now and then she would glance over her shoulder at him, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. They stopped in front of a large, decaying house at the town's center. It was grander than the others, with a wide porch and tall, broken windows. Evelyn's expression darkened as she looked at it. "This is where it happened," she whispered, almost to herself. David frowned. "What happened?" Evelyn turned to him, her eyes now hollow and filled with sorrow. "The reason the town was abandoned. The fire." David felt a chill run down his spine. "A fire?" she nodded. "Years ago, this house caught fire during a town celebration. The blaze spread quickly, and before anyone could stop it, most of Briar Hollow was in flames. So many people died that night." David swallowed hard, suddenly feeling uneasy. The air around him felt colder, the oppressive silence closing in. "That's awful," he muttered, taking a step back from the house. "It was," Evelyn said softly, her voice distant. "But not everyone left." Her words sent a jolt of fear through David. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned and started walking toward the house, her hand resting on the charred doorframe. "There are those who are still here," she said finally, her voice low. "Trapped. Waiting." David's heart began to race. He glanced around, suddenly hyper-aware of his surroundings. The town seemed darker now, the buildings looming like silent sentinels. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "You mean ghosts?" he asked, half joking to mask his growing fear. Evelyn didn't smile. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. Something like that. The unease that had been building inside David surged into full-blown fear. He backed away slowly, his mind screaming at him to leave. But then Evelyn stepped closer, her face pale and strained. "You shouldn't have come here, David." He froze. "How do you know my name?" Evelyn's face twisted into something cold, her eyes gleaming with something dark. "You were brought here," she said, her voice no longer soft but commanding, "just like the others." David's throat went dry. He turned and bolted, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't look back as he sprinted through the streets, desperately trying to find his car. But the town seemed to shift around him, the once familiar paths twisting into a labyrinth. Finally, he spotted his car up ahead, the only thing in the town that seemed real. He lunged for the door, yanking it open and diving inside. His hands fumbled with the keys, and he shoved them into the ignition, heart hammering. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. Without a second thought, he floored the gas pedal, speeding down the narrow road out of Briar Hollow. As he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw Evelyn standing in the middle of the street, watching him with that same cold, unreadable expression. He didn't stop until he was miles away, the ruined town long behind him. His heart still raced, and his mind buzzed with questions. Who was Evelyn? Why had she led him through the town? And then something clicked. David pulled over to the side of the road and grabbed his camera, flipping through the pictures he had taken in Briar Hollow. His breath caught in his throat when he realized the truth. In every picture, Evelyn was nowhere to be seen. David felt the blood drain from his face. She had never been real, or maybe she had been real once, but not anymore. He had been guided through Briar Hollow by something that wasn't human, and for whatever reason she had let him go. For now, with shaking hands he put the camera down and drove away, hoping he could forget the ghostly guide who had almost claimed him. But deep down he knew the truth. Briar Hollow wasn't done with him yet.
Story number 6.
The Ghost in the Clock. Emily stood in front of the towering grandfather clock in the living room of her new home. It had been in the house when she and her husband Mark moved in 2 months ago, a relic left behind by the previous owners. The clock was an imposing presence, its dark mahogany frame polished to a gleam, intricate carvings winding their way up its sides. The brass pendulum swung with hypnotic precision, creating a deep, rhythmic ticking that seemed to fill the entire house. "Do you think we should get rid of it?" Emily asked, watching the pendulum sway. The clock unnerved her. It wasn't just its size or the steady ticking. There was something else, something she couldn't quite put into words. Mark shrugged. "It's an antique. Could be worth something." "Maybe. It just feels off." Mark laughed, ruffling her hair. "You're imagining things. Relax, babe." But Emily couldn't relax. The longer they stayed in the house, the more unsettled she became. The clock's ticking seemed to grow louder at night, reverberating through the walls, disturbing her sleep. And then there were the noises, soft, shuffling sounds that seemed to come from the clock itself, always around midnight. One night, after another bout of restless sleep, Emily woke to the sound of faint footsteps outside her bedroom door. She sat up, heart pounding in her chest. The clock downstairs chimed 12 times, each chime echoing through the house like a heavy toll. She nudged Mark awake. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Hear what?" "Footsteps. Outside the door." Mark groaned, rolling over. "You're dreaming again, Em. Go back to sleep." But she wasn't dreaming. She knew what she had heard. Determined to prove she wasn't losing her mind, Emily got out of bed, grabbing the small flashlight from her nightstand. She crept into the hallway, her feet cold against the wooden floor. The house was silent except for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock below. She made her way downstairs, careful not to make a sound. The living room was dim, the only light coming from the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. The clock stood in its usual place, its pendulum swinging methodically. Emily approached it, her heart racing. She leaned in, placing her ear against the wood, and listened. There. Faint scratching sounds, like nails scraping against the inside of the clock. She took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. Could there be something inside? The rational part of her mind told her it was just an old clock, creaking with age. But there was another part, the part that had been growing louder since they moved in, that whispered something more sinister. The following night, Emily decided to investigate. While Mark was out late for a work meeting, she fetched a screwdriver from the toolbox and stood in front of the clock, hands trembling. She had to know what was behind the clock face, what was making those sounds. The ticking seemed louder tonight, almost as if the clock knew what she was about to do. She unscrewed the back panel with shaking hands, exposing the inner workings of the clock. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The gears and cogs were all in place, operating smoothly. But then she noticed a small compartment hidden behind the pendulum. Her heart pounded as she pried it open. Inside was a bundle of old, yellowed papers tied together with a fraying ribbon. She took them out carefully, her fingers trembling. As she untied the ribbon, the first page fell open, revealing a faded handwritten note. To the one who reads this, know that the clock is cursed. It was not always so, but now it is a prison for the soul that resides within it. Do not let the clock strike midnight. If it does, the spirit trapped within will be freed. Emily's breath caught in her throat. A chill ran down her spine as she stared at the note. Was this some kind of sick joke? She flipped through the remaining pages, each one detailing the history of the clock. According to the notes, the clock had once belonged to a man named William Greaves, a clockmaker from the early 19th century. Greaves had been obsessed with creating a perfect timepiece, one that would outlast him. But after a series of misfortunes, including the mysterious death of his wife, he had become consumed by grief and madness. It was said that Greaves had performed a ritual to bind his soul to the clock, trapping himself inside it. The notes claimed that every night at the stroke of midnight, his spirit would attempt to escape. Emily felt a sudden urgency to close the compartment, to put everything back. She glanced at the clock. It was 11:45 p.m. The ticking seemed louder now, each tick resonating through the room like a heartbeat. Suddenly, the clock's pendulum stopped mid-swing. The house fell eerily silent. Emily stared at the clock, her pulse racing. The hands were inching closer to midnight, moving with an unnatural speed. She fumbled with the back panel, trying to put it back in place, but her hands were trembling too much. The clock struck once. The sound was deafening, reverberating through the room like a thunderclap. Emily screamed, dropping the screwdriver. The clock struck again, and this time the air in the room seemed to shift. A cold breeze swept through the house, and Emily felt something move behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. The clock struck a third time. Shadows seemed to pool in the corners of the room, dark and oppressive. Emily backed away from the clock, her heart pounding. She had to stop it. She had to stop the clock from striking 12. But before she could reach it, the 12th chime echoed through the house. The moment the sound faded, a figure materialized in front of the clock. A tall, gaunt man in a tattered coat, his eyes hollow and burning with fury. William Greaves. Emily stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The man moved toward her, his face twisted in a grotesque grin. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he stopped. His gaze shifted to the clock. The pendulum had started swinging again, ticking away the seconds. Greaves' grin faltered, and with a howl of rage, his form began to flicker. Emily watched in stunned horror as he was pulled back toward the clock, his body dissolving into shadow. The last thing she saw before he vanished completely was the look of pure hatred in his eyes. The clock was silent once more, but now, every night at midnight, Emily could hear it, a faint scratching sound coming from the clock. Greaves wasn't gone, not completely.
Story number 7.
Haunted Path. The sun dipped behind the towering pines as Emily trudged down the forest path, her boots crunching on the thick layer of pine needles. The trail, known locally as the Haunted Path, was infamous for strange sightings and ghostly apparitions, but to Emily, it was nothing more than folklore to spook tourists. She had walked this path dozens of times during her childhood. It was a shortcut between her family's cabin and the village on the other side of the woods. Tonight, however, it felt different. Emily was visiting her late grandmother's cabin, trying to settle her estate. The village seemed frozen in time, the same quiet place she remembered, but a subtle unease clung to the air. As she entered the forest, she had shrugged off the warnings from the villagers. Superstitious tales about the path where people claimed to hear whispers and see flickering lights in the woods. But now, with the daylight fading, those tales gnawed at the back of her mind. The trees seemed to close in, their branches like skeletal fingers against the blood-orange sky. The deeper she ventured, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no wind, just her footsteps. Emily's pulse quickened, her earlier confidence beginning to wane. A rustling sound caught her attention. She stopped, heart thudding in her chest. Something moved in the underbrush to her right. Slowly, she turned her head, scanning the shadows between the trees. Nothing. She let out a shaky breath, convincing herself it was just a small animal or the wind. She kept walking, but now her mind was on high alert. Every snap of a twig, every flutter of leaves sent a jolt through her body. The path wound deeper into the woods, twisting and turning in ways she didn't quite remember. How long has it been since I was last here, she thought, trying to recall the last time she'd walked this trail. It had been years, maybe even a decade. She couldn't remember the path ever feeling this long, this endless. Then she heard it, a whisper. Low and indistinct, like someone was speaking just out of earshot. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. She strained her ears, trying to make out the words, but they were faint, as if carried by the wind. She spun around, half expecting to see someone standing behind her, but the path was empty. "Hello?" she called out, her voice sounding too loud in the stillness. No response. She started walking again, faster this time. Her hand instinctively went to her phone, but there was no signal, no surprise there. This deep in the woods, it was a dead zone. The whispers returned, louder now, but still just beyond comprehension. Her steps quickened as her fear began to escalate into panic. The path forked ahead, left or right. She didn't remember a fork. Confusion set in. She hesitated, scanning both directions. They looked identical, both snaking into the gloom. She took the left path, hoping it was the right choice. The trees pressed closer, the darkness thicker, the whispers louder. Her breath came in shallow, rapid bursts as her mind began to spiral. Then up ahead, she saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the path. It was a woman, pale and motionless, her back to Emily. She wore a long, tattered dress that fluttered slightly, though there was no wind. Emily's heart slammed against her ribs as she stopped dead in her tracks. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The woman didn't respond. She just stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for something or someone. A cold chill swept over Emily. She took a cautious step forward, then another. Something was terribly wrong, but she couldn't explain why. The woman seemed off. Not just out of place, but unnatural, like she didn't quite belong in this world. As Emily inched closer, she noticed the woman's hair, long and stringy, covering her face. Emily's stomach twisted into knots. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, to run, but her feet kept moving. Just as she was about to speak again, the woman slowly turned her head, revealing a face that wasn't human at all. Empty eye sockets stared back at her, a gaping mouth stretched in a soundless scream. Emily stumbled backward, a scream clawing its way out of her throat. The woman took a step toward her, moving jerkily, like a puppet on strings. Emily turned and ran, her legs pumping furiously as terror surged through her veins. She sprinted down the path, branches whipping at her face, her breath ragged and sharp. The whispers were louder now, surrounding her, filling her ears, her head. The trees blurred as she ran faster, desperate to escape whatever was chasing her. And then, without warning, the path ended. Emily skidded to a halt, nearly tumbling over the edge of a steep ravine. She spun around, panting, her heart pounding in her chest. The woman was gone. The whispers had stopped. All was silent. She stood there for a moment, trying to catch her breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She glanced back at the path, expecting to see the woman reappear, but the trail was empty, stretching out behind her in eerie stillness. Suddenly, she realized something chilling. The path behind her, the one she had just run down, was completely overgrown, as if it hadn't been used in years. The trees were thick and tangled, the trail barely visible beneath the underbrush. How was that possible? Her blood ran cold as a terrifying thought crept into her mind. The haunted path wasn't just a trail through the woods. It was a place between life and death, between the living and the dead, and Emily had just crossed over. She stood at the edge of the ravine, staring at the silent, forgotten path behind her, knowing deep down that she would never leave these woods. Because once you take the haunted path, there's no going back.
Story number 8.
Eternal night. The wind howled through the jagged trees like a wounded beast, its mournful cries echoing across the darkened hills. The moon was hidden behind a veil of thick clouds, leaving the night in a suffocating darkness that clung to everything it touched. Martha gripped the wheel tighter, her knuckles whitening as she struggled to keep her eyes on the narrow road winding through the dense forest. "Just a few more miles," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. The cabin, her family's secluded getaway, was supposed to be a place of refuge, a place to escape from the noise of the city. But tonight, it felt more like a trap. The radio, long dead from lack of signal, crackled to life for a moment, hissing static before going silent again. Martha glanced at it, frowning. She was sure the storm had knocked out power lines miles ago, yet the momentary burst of life from the radio sent an eerie chill down her spine. Her phone buzzed weakly on the seat beside her. She glanced at the screen. No signal! Not surprising. She was too deep into the woods now, but something about the phone flashing on and off unsettled her. as if it, too, were trying to send her a warning. Ahead, the headlights flickered briefly before illuminating the familiar turnoff. She sighed in relief, the gravel crunching beneath the tires as she pulled up to the cabin. The structure loomed in the darkness, a shadowy outline against the backdrop of trees. She shut off the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the deafening silence. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car, the chill of the night biting at her skin. The scent of pine and wet earth filled the air as she trudged toward the cabin door. Her fingers fumbled with the keys, the weight of the night's oppressive atmosphere making her movements slow and clumsy. Finally, the door creaked open, revealing the familiar, cozy interior. The fireplace sat cold and empty, the scent of dust hanging in the air. Martha flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. "Great. Power's out," she muttered, already expecting it. She fished her flashlight from her bag, casting a narrow beam across the room. As the light danced over the walls, she froze. The room wasn't as she had left it. The pictures on the mantel were askew, the curtains half drawn. The air felt thick, as though someone or something had been inside. A noise, a faint scraping, came from behind her. Martha spun around, the flashlight shaking in her grip. The door she had just closed stood slightly ajar, moving ever so slightly in the night's breeze. Her heart hammered in her chest, the sound of blood rushing in her ears. She walked to the door and pushed it shut again, sliding the deadbolt into place. But as she turned, she heard the sound again, this time from upstairs. The faint sound of footsteps. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. No one was supposed to be here. Gathering her courage, Martha crept toward the staircase, every step feeling like 1,000. Her flashlight trembled in her hand, casting strange shadows along the walls. The stairs creaked beneath her weight, and with each groan, her fear grew. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched before her, the doors to the bedrooms looming like dark sentinels. She swallowed hard, stepping forward. The first door on the left, the guest room, was slightly ajar. Martha hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to leave. But something compelled her to move closer, as if some unseen force was pulling her toward it. She pushed the door open with a soft creak, her flashlight revealing the empty bed, the covers undisturbed. Relief flooded her for a moment, until she noticed something odd. A figure stood in the corner, barely visible, shrouded in darkness. She froze, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It was just there, a dark silhouette that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Martha stepped back, her hand trembling as she aimed the flashlight more directly at the corner. The beam flickered and died, plunging the room into blackness. Her heart pounded violently as she fumbled with the flashlight, trying desperately to get it to work. Then suddenly, a cold voice whispered from the darkness, chilling her to her core. "You shouldn't have come back." Martha gasped, her hands shaking as she finally managed to turn the light back on. The figure was gone. Terrified, she backed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. She stumbled down the hallway, her mind racing. She had to leave, had to get out of the cabin. But as she reached the stairs, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The front door, once deadbolted, was wide open. She turned, ready to bolt down the stairs, but stopped short. At the bottom of the staircase, a woman stood. Her face was familiar, unnervingly so. It was her. Martha was looking at herself. The doppelganger smiled, a twisted, malevolent grin. Martha's heart raced as the other her spoke, her voice dripping with malice. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you? This place doesn't let anyone go." Martha stumbled back, nearly falling as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The cabin was alive, feeding off her fear. But how? Why? The doppelganger took a step forward, and Martha felt a sudden dizziness, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. "You're not the first," the other her whispered, "and you won't be the last. The night here never ends. It's eternal." With a final surge of adrenaline, Martha ran past her double and out the front door into the cold night. The trees closed in around her, their twisted branches reaching for her as she stumbled through the forest, the cabin fading behind her. But no matter how far she ran, the darkness never lifted, and as the night stretched on, the truth became horrifyingly clear. She wasn't running from the cabin. She was trapped within it, caught in a never-ending night, forever hunted by herself. The eternal night had claimed another soul.
Story number 9.
Haunted reflection. In the small, sleepy town of Ravenswood, where every home was steeped in history and secrets, the old Whitaker estate loomed large. It was a grand, decrepit mansion, its once majestic facade now a canvas for nature's creeping decay. The locals whispered tales about the Whitaker estate, but none so chilling as the legend of the haunted mirror. The mirror, a massive, ornate piece framed in intricately carved mahogany, had been in the Whitaker family for generations. It was said to have been a gift from a Victorian-era sorceress, a dark artifact with a sinister past. Over time, the stories had changed, but the core remained. Those who gazed into the mirror would see not only their own reflection, but the ghostly apparitions of those who had died tragically. When Daniel Rook, an ambitious paranormal investigator, arrived in Ravenswood, he was skeptical. He'd heard of the mirror and its sinister reputation, but dismissed it as local superstition. His skepticism was tested when he was granted access to the Whitaker estate by its current elderly caretaker, Mrs. Eliza Wren. Eliza was a frail woman with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of sadness. She spoke of the mirror with a trembling voice, a stark contrast to her otherwise calm demeanor. "You mustn't look too long," she warned Daniel as she handed him an old brass key. "The mirror shows things that should remain unseen." Daniel, however, was driven by the thrill of unraveling the unknown. Armed with his camera, voice recorder, and an assortment of paranormal detection equipment, he ventured into the mansion. The house was as he expected, dusty, cobweb-laden, and filled with the musty odor of neglect. He made his way through creaking corridors and empty rooms until he reached the ballroom, where the mirror stood against the wall, covered with a heavy velvet cloth. With a mix of trepidation and excitement, Daniel pulled the cloth away, revealing the mirror. Its surface was surprisingly pristine, reflecting the grand room in pristine clarity. The ornate frame, while covered in a thin layer of dust, still held a certain elegance. Daniel set up his equipment and began his investigation, capturing footage and recording the ambient sounds of the house. As the hours passed, Daniel grew increasingly intrigued by the mirror. The old tales seemed more like fantasy than reality. He moved closer to the mirror, examining its surface more closely. The glass seemed almost too clear, too perfect. It was as if the reflection within was not just a reflection, but a portal to another realm. As the night deepened, the atmosphere in the ballroom grew heavier. The temperature dropped, and an uneasy silence filled the space. Daniel's breath fogged the air, and the hairs on his neck stood on end. He decided to look into the mirror once more, hoping to capture something extraordinary. At first, all he saw was his own reflection, his face illuminated by the dim light of his flashlight. But as he continued to gaze, something strange began to happen. The reflection started to shift. The ballroom behind him in the mirror seemed to change, becoming darker and more distorted. Shadows flickered in the periphery of his vision. Suddenly, the reflection of the ballroom was replaced by a scene from the past. Daniel saw a lavishly dressed woman from the Victorian era, her eyes wide with terror. She was being chased by an unseen force, her mouth open in a silent scream. The image was fleeting, but it was enough to send a chill down Daniel's spine. He pulled back from the mirror, shaking his head, trying to convince himself it was a trick of the light. But as he did, he noticed something else, a figure standing behind him in the mirror. It was a shadowy presence, indistinct but undeniably there. Daniel turned quickly, but there was nothing but empty space behind him. He returned his gaze to the mirror. The shadow was still there, now closer, its form becoming more defined. The figure was tall, with an indistinct face that seemed to be staring directly at him. Panic began to rise in Daniel's chest. He grabbed his camera, trying to capture the apparition, but the figure seemed to dissolve whenever he tried to focus on it. The temperature dropped further and a low, mournful wail filled the room. Daniel's breath was visible in the frigid air, and his heart pounded in his chest. The wail grew louder, more insistent. It was as if the sound was coming from within the mirror itself. Desperate to escape, Daniel stumbled backward, knocking over a small table in his haste. He glanced one last time at the mirror and saw that the shadowy figure was now reaching out, its hand stretching toward him through the glass. The reflection of the ballroom began to warp, becoming a swirling vortex of darkness. With a final, terrified glance, Daniel fled from the ballroom, leaving behind his equipment and the haunted mirror. He burst through the mansion's front door into the night, the cool air a sharp contrast to the stifling terror he had just experienced. As he made his way back to his car, he glanced over his shoulder at the Whitaker estate. The old house loomed ominously in the darkness, its windows like hollow eyes watching his retreat. The mirror's sinister presence was now firmly etched in his memory. Weeks later, Daniel returned to his apartment and reviewed the footage from his investigation. To his horror, the video showed something he had missed. During the brief moments when the mirror's surface had warped, his own reflection had been replaced by that of a terrified figure. It was as if the mirror had captured his fear and turned it into its own image. But the most disturbing revelation came when Daniel discovered an old photograph in his research about the Whitaker estate. It was a faded image of the mansion's original occupants, a Victorian family. In the photograph, there was a woman who looked strikingly similar to the figure Daniel had seen in the mirror. The caption beneath the photograph read, "Eleanor Whitaker, lost to the mirror's curse." Daniel's realization was chilling. The mirror didn't just show the past, it trapped souls within its glass, feeding on their fear and despair. Eleanor Whitaker had been the last victim, and now the mirror had found a new one. As he sat in his apartment, the mirror's curse seemed to linger, its malevolent presence never truly leaving him. Daniel understood that some reflections were not meant to be seen, and some stories were better left untold.
Story number 10.
The Phantom's Call. In the small, fog-enshrouded town of Larkspur, the old crane house had long been an enigma. It stood on the outskirts, its once grand facade now a decaying relic of a bygone era. Rumors whispered through the narrow streets, tales of a phantom who roamed the corridors, a spirit trapped by a sinister past. But for Jenna, a young journalist with a penchant for debunking myths, it was the perfect opportunity for a story. On a crisp autumn evening, Jenna arrived at the crane house, her flashlight casting an eerie glow on the ivy-clad walls. The wind howled mournfully as if warning her to turn back. Undeterred, she pushed open the heavy wooden door, which creaked ominously in protest. Inside, the air was cold and stale, heavy with dust and the scent of old wood. Jenna's footsteps echoed through the grand foyer as she set up her equipment. A voice recorder, a camera, and a thermal scanner. Her plan was simple: document any paranormal activity and debunk the myths surrounding the house. She began her investigation on the ground floor, methodically recording every creak and shadow. As the hours passed, Jenna grew increasingly unnerved. The house seemed to have a life of its own, every sound amplified in the silence. Her breath misted in the chill, and an oppressive sense of dread began to settle over her. At midnight, the temperature dropped suddenly. Jenna's thermal scanner flickered, showing a cold spot near the staircase. With a determined frown, she climbed the stairs, the old wood groaning under her weight. At the top, a narrow hallway stretched before her, lined with doors leading to forgotten rooms. Jenna chose the room at the end, a faint light slipping through the gap beneath the door. It was as if someone, or something, was waiting. Inside, the room was bathed in moonlight, revealing a dusty bed and an antique mirror. Jenna's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. She set her equipment up once more, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted the camera. She could feel eyes on her, the sensation so palpable that she turned around quickly, but the room remained empty. Suddenly, the voice recorder picked up a faint, distorted whisper. Jenna leaned in, her heart pounding. The whisper seemed to say, "Help me." She reviewed the recording, her face paling. There was no mistake. The voice was desperate, almost pleading. Jenna's rational mind fought against the fear creeping up her spine. She decided to press on, convinced there was a logical explanation. As she investigated further, she found a dusty old diary hidden in the drawer of an old desk. Flipping through the pages, she discovered it belonged to Eliza Crane, the last of the Crane family. The entries were filled with despair and fear, detailing strange occurrences and an ominous presence she could not escape. One entry stood out. "The phantom calls, and I am bound to this place. I have tried to leave, but the house won't let me go. Beware, for the calling is not just a warning, it is a trap." Jenna's pulse quickened. She looked around, feeling increasingly trapped by the house's oppressive atmosphere. A sudden chill swept through the room, and the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Jenna's breath caught in her throat as she struggled to open it, her efforts proving futile. Panic set in. Her flashlight began to flicker uncontrollably, casting erratic beams of light that danced around the room. Shadows seemed to writhe and twist, taking on grotesque shapes. In the mirror, Jenna saw a figure, a shadowy silhouette of a woman with hollow eyes. It reached out toward her, its mouth moving in silent agony. In a frantic attempt to escape, Jenna grabbed the diary and raced back to the stairs. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the whispering voices that filled the air. The temperature dropped again, and the shadows grew darker, more menacing. Just as she reached the bottom of the stairs, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. Desperate, Jenna burst through the front door and into the foggy night. The house loomed behind her, its windows dark and foreboding. She stumbled down the path, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and made her way to her car. As she drove away, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an alert from her voice recorder, which she had left behind in the Crane house. She hesitated, then played the recording through her car's speakers. The whispering grew louder, more coherent. It was no longer just a plea for help, but a clear message. You should not have come. The house is hungry. Jenna's hands trembled as she continued to listen. The recording revealed a chilling detail she had missed earlier, a distorted voice that was not Eliza Crane's, but her own. The realization hit her with a cold, paralyzing fear. The house had been manipulating her all along, using her own voice to lure her deeper into its trap. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a new message. It was a photograph from the Crane house's camera, a picture of the room she had just left. In the corner of the photo, behind Jenna's own reflection in the mirror, stood a figure with a cruel, triumphant smile. Jenna pulled over, her hands shaking as she tried to comprehend the message. The phantom, she realized, was not just a ghost, but an entity that fed on fear and despair, using its victims to trap others. The house was not merely haunted. It was alive, a predator lurking in the fog. As she drove away from Larkspur, the fog thickened around her, the road ahead disappearing into the murk. Jenna knew that she had narrowly escaped a fate far worse than death, and though she was free, the Crane house was far from finished. It would continue to call, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too close. And somewhere in the depths of the house, Eliza Crane's spirit remained, forever trapped, forever haunted, just like Jenna's own lingering fear.